The most dangerous kind of control doesn't start with chains. It starts with, God told me. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where devotion gets flipped into leverage, where a pulpit becomes a throne, and where the words meant to heal are re-engineered to intimidate. Not every leader on this list was famous. In this video, we're breaking down 10 religious leaders who used God for power and control, and we're doing it like a case file: the public image, the private system, the turning point, and the collapse. You'll hear how authority gets built, how loyalty gets enforced, and why the downfall is almost always triggered by one thing: somebody finally talking. Now, before we start, I need you to do one quick thing. Like and subscribe for daily deep dives into the psychology of power, manipulation stories that reveal how influence really works. If you've ever wondered how people get pulled into systems like these, you're in the right place. Because the first name on this list didn't just preach, he built a trap. Chapter 1. Tony Alamo. He didn't look like a monster. That was the first advantage. Tony Alamo sold himself like a warning siren wrapped in a hymn, loud enough to command attention, polished enough to earn trust. To his followers, he wasn't just a preacher. He was a pipeline to heaven, a man who claimed his words came with divine backing. But here's the twist. What if the miracles were never the point? What if the real product wasn't salvation, but submission? Because once someone believes you speak for God, you don't need permission anymore. Before the ministry, he was a drifter, chasing relevance, bouncing through the edges of show business. He learned something early. People don't only follow truth, they follow confidence, and confidence can be manufactured. When he met Susan, the pair built what looked like a rescue mission, a place for the broken, the lost, the people who wanted meaning more than comfort. On the outside, it resembled charity. Inside, it operated like a closed system. The strategy was simple, and it worked because it sounded holy. Step 1. Separate the follower from the old world. Family becomes a distraction. Friends become temptations. Outside news becomes lies. The moment you cut someone off from their baseline reality, you can rewrite the rules. And Tony rewrote them fast. People were pushed to surrender possessions, abandon personal plans, and serve full-time. Work that never paid, but was framed as spiritual privilege. Step 2. Make obedience feel like purity. Questioning wasn't disagreement, it was rebellion. Doubt wasn't uncertainty, it was sin. And when every normal emotion gets renamed as a spiritual flaw, the follower starts policing themselves. That's how control becomes self-sustaining. And then came the most dangerous upgrade. He turned his authority into law. Tony didn't present orders as opinions. He delivered them like verdicts. He wrapped demands in scripture, moral language, and fear. Fear of losing salvation. Fear of being cast out. Fear of being labeled evil. In systems like that, the punishment isn't just discipline. It's an exile. An exile, to a person who has been isolated, feels like death. So ask yourself, how do you keep hundreds of people in line without bars? You convince them the outside world is poison. You convince them leaving means spiritual destruction. And you convince them you're the only antidote. For years, rumors floated around him like smoke, quiet allegations, former members whispering about spiritual unions, underage girls being called wives, scripture being twisted into justification. But for a long time, it stayed stuck in the shadows because the victims were trapped between two terrors: the leader's power inside the group and the fear of not being believed outside it. until the testimonies stopped being whispers. Once enough former followers stepped forward, the image began to crack. Investigators didn't look at his ministry like a church. They looked at it like a machine. Who controlled the money? Who controlled movement? Who controlled information? And when the pieces lined up, what was once religion in the eyes of supporters started to resemble something much colder, a structure built for exploitation. Then the moment arrived that every self-declared chosen one eventually faces earthly consequences. When he was finally arrested, the narrative he pushed was predictable: persecution, a government attack, a war on faith. That story is powerful because it turns accountability into martyrdom. It gives followers a ready-made excuse to ignore evidence. But courtrooms don't run on sermons. Witnesses described how control worked in practice, how boundaries were blurred, how obedience was demanded, how fear was weaponized. Prosecutors argued it wasn't spiritual leadership. It was a calculated system that used religious authority as camouflage. The defense tried to paint it as misunderstanding, as bias, as people turning against the church. But the pattern was too consistent. Too many accounts matched. Too many details overlapped. And the verdict didn't just punish him, it detonated the illusion. The conviction landed like a thunderclap, because once a man is exposed in public, his magic shrinks fast. The empire that was built on belief starts losing oxygen. Lawsuits followed. Assets slipped away. The machine that looked invincible suddenly looked fragile. Here's what's haunting. Tony didn't need to physically lock doors to keep people inside. He locked their minds first. That's the real horror of spiritual control. People end up defending the cage because they've been taught the cage is safety. The softest voice can hide the sharpest control. And if you think this story ends with him being taken away, listen closely, because the next leader didn't just control a congregation. He controlled entire families like pieces on a board. Chapter 2. Warren Jeffs. Power doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it inherits a throne. Warren Jeffs didn't seize authority through charisma alone. He stepped into a system already designed for obedience. And once he had it, he tightened every screw. To the outside world, he appeared withdrawn, almost fragile, soft-spoken, awkward, not the image you'd expect from a man who would eventually dictate the lives, marriages, and futures of thousands. But inside his community, his voice wasn't just respected, it was law. Because when a leader claims God speaks only through him, disagreement becomes impossible. Warren Jeffs rose to power after his father's death, inheriting leadership over a closed religious society built on strict hierarchy and total submission. From childhood, members were taught one central rule: obedience equals salvation. Men were conditioned to obey leaders. Women were conditioned to obey men. Children were conditioned to obey everyone above them. It wasn't just culture, it was theology. And Warren didn't just maintain that structure, he refined it. The first move was fear management. He preached relentlessly about purity, sin, and eternal consequences. But the punishment wasn't abstract, it was immediate. Men who questioned him were expelled, cut off from their families, stripped of their homes, erased overnight. Their wives and children were reassigned to loyal followers like property. Imagine that power for a moment. The ability to dissolve a family with a sentence, to turn devotion into a weapon, to make loyalty the only currency that mattered. And then he took the final step. He centralized everything around himself. Warren didn't just approve marriages, He arranged them. Girls were told who they would marry, when they would marry, and why refusing was an act of spiritual rebellion. Adult men were paired with underage girls under the banner of sacred unions. Resistance wasn't framed as personal choice. It was framed as eternal failure. And here's the cruel brilliance of it. The victims were taught to see themselves as chosen. Families who tried to leave described a system built on psychological captivity. Members were monitored, movements tracked, conversations controlled. Even clothing choices were dictated. Everything reinforced one message: your survival depends on obedience to the prophet. For years, the outside world struggled to intervene. The community was sealed. Members didn't speak to outsiders. And when rumors leaked about underage marriages, abuse, forced separation, they were dismissed as exaggerations or religious bias. Until one accusation changed everything. When formal charges were finally filed, Warren Jeffs didn't defend himself. He disappeared. A manhunt followed. The prophet became a fugitive. His image, once hidden behind compound walls, appeared on wanted posters nationwide. The irony was brutal. A man who claimed divine protection, now relying on disguises, cash, and silence. His arrest shattered the illusion for some followers. For others, it reinforced it. That's the danger of absolute belief. Evidence doesn't weaken it. Evidence can strengthen it. Because when someone is taught that persecution proves righteousness, accountability looks like confirmation. Inside the courtroom, the tone shifted. Audio recordings were played. Testimonies were heard. Prosecutors laid out a clear pattern. Authority used to isolate. Fear used to control. Doctrine used to excuse exploitation. The defense argued faith. The prosecution argued harm. And this time, belief didn't outweigh proof. The conviction was devastating, not just legally, but psychologically. For the first time, the man who dictated eternal outcomes was powerless. He could no longer arrange marriages. He could no longer expel dissenters. He could no longer rewrite reality from behind a pulpit. But even from prison, the influence didn't vanish overnight. Messages continued. Instructions leaked out. Some followers still believed he would be freed. Others slowly began to question everything they had sacrificed. Communities fractured. Families split again, this time between belief and doubt. Here's the unsettling truth. Warren Jeffs didn't invent control. He perfected it inside a system that rewarded silence and punished curiosity. He proved that you don't need physical violence to dominate lives, only unquestioned authority and the threat of spiritual loss. The most absolute prisons are built from belief. Today, he sits behind bars, stripped of titles, stripped of power, living under rules he once enforced on others. But the damage didn't end with his sentencing. Survivors are still rebuilding identities that were never allowed to exist. And if you think this story is extreme, if you think it's an outlier, brace yourself. Because the next leader didn't just rewrite scripture, he rewrote reality itself. Chapter 3: Dwight York. Some leaders tighten control by narrowing belief. Dwight York did the opposite. He expanded it until no one could tell where faith ended and fantasy began. And inside that confusion, he built absolute authority. To outsiders, his teachings looked chaotic. Egyptian symbols, UFO lore, Islamic language, Hebrew traditions, science fiction imagery, all fused into one shifting doctrine. But to followers, the constant change wasn't a flaw. It was proof. Proof that York had access to knowledge the rest of the world couldn't handle. Because when truth keeps changing, only the messenger stays permanent. York's power didn't come from consistency. It came from reinvention. Every time a prediction failed or a belief was questioned, the doctrine evolved. One year he was a religious scholar. The next, a cosmic envoy. Then a divine teacher from another star system. Each transformation carried the same underlying message. I alone receive the updates. That belief created dependency. Followers didn't anchor themselves to scripture, tradition, or community. They anchored themselves to him. And when belief depends on one man's mind, control becomes effortless. He eventually relocated his operation to rural Georgia, constructing an elaborate compound filled with pyramids, obelisks, and statues painted in gold. It looked like a spiritual theme park, but it functioned like a fortress. Gates, guards, and rules separated insiders from the outside world. And inside those walls, identity was no longer personal. It was assigned. Members were told how to dress, how to speak, how to raise children, and how to interpret reality. Independent thought wasn't punished outright. It was drowned. York kept followers busy with rituals, teachings, rewrites, and ceremonies. There was always something new to learn, something new to obey, something new to fear missing out on. The most effective control doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like privilege. Former members later described how obedience escalated quietly. Certain individuals were selected for special spiritual advancement. These private sessions were framed as honor, as elevation. Questioning the process meant questioning your worth, your faith, your destiny. And when someone did question it, the system turned on them. They were shamed, isolated, reframed as corrupt. In groups like this, dissent isn't disagreement, it's contamination. For years, the outside world saw nothing but spectacle. Local officials were suspicious, but suspicion isn't evidence. The compound expanded, donations flowed, followers defended York fiercely, convinced he was being targeted because he challenged mainstream belief systems. To them, scrutiny was proof of importance, but everything changed with one tip. When authorities finally moved in, they weren't expecting what they found. The investigation went far beyond zoning disputes or financial irregularities. Prosecutors began assembling testimonies that painted a disturbing picture, one of systematic manipulation, coercion, and exploitation carried out under the cover of spiritual authority. Courtrooms don't care how unusual beliefs sound. They care how power is used. And what unfolded wasn't chaos. It was structure. Witness after witness described the same mechanics: loyalty tests, fear-based obedience, isolation from family, and an environment where York's word overrode personal boundaries. Prosecutors argued that his ever-changing identity wasn't spiritual evolution. It was a shield. A way to stay ahead of accountability by constantly shifting the narrative. The defense claimed persecution, cultural bias, government fear of unconventional religion, but evidence doesn't fade just because belief is loud. Financial trails, consistent testimony, documented control. The verdict dismantled the myth. York wasn't sentenced for being strange. He was sentenced for how he used power. The compound was seized. The monuments came down. The gold paint chipped away. What once looked mystical was reduced to concrete and dust. But even after conviction, the grip didn't vanish instantly. Some followers clung to belief, insisting the system had attacked the divine messenger. Others broke free and faced a terrifying question. If he wasn't who he said he was, then who was I while I believed him? That's the hidden cost of manipulation. It doesn't just steal years, it steals identity. When belief shifts daily, control becomes permanent. Dwight York's story proves something crucial. You don't need a single doctrine to dominate people. You just need to make yourself the source of meaning. As long as followers believe only you can interpret reality, you never lose power. And the next leader on this list didn't build pyramids or claim alien origins. He wore suits, shook hands with politicians, and hid his control in plain sight. Chapter 4. Henry Lyons. Not every abuse of faith hides in compounds or secret doctrines. Sometimes it wears a tailored suit, speaks at national conferences, and smiles beside lawmakers. Henry Lyons didn't rule through fear-filled prophecy. He ruled through respectability, and that made him even harder to question. To millions, he was the image of institutional faith, measured, articulate, and powerful. As the head of a major religious organization, he stood at the intersection of money, politics, and belief. People didn't see him as a preacher chasing power. They saw him as a steward trusted with it. Because when authority looks professional, suspicion feels inappropriate. Lyons rose through the ranks with ambition and polish. He knew how systems worked, how committees moved money, how donations flowed, how public trust could be leveraged. And unlike the charismatic figures before him, he didn't need theatrics. His power came from access, budgets, contracts, influence. From the outside, his leadership looked like progress, fundraisers, initiatives, and partnerships. But inside the machinery, something else was happening. Money raised in the name of service began drifting into places it never should have gone. Luxury purchases, private indulgences, personal relationships funded by institutional accounts. The alarming part wasn't just the spending, it was how quietly it happened. Because no one expects corruption from the man signing the checks. For years, Lyons' reputation insulated him. Boards trusted him. Members defended him. Questioning felt disloyal. After all, this wasn't a fringe leader operating on the margins. This was a man at the center of organized faith, someone who represented millions. Then came the moment that cracked the image wide open. A suspicious house fire triggered more than emergency sirens. It triggered scrutiny. Investigators began tracing ownership records, financial ties, and hidden relationships. What they found unraveled the carefully maintained narrative of integrity. Lyons wasn't just mismanaging funds. He was allegedly treating religious resources like a personal investment portfolio. Properties were purchased. Gifts were exchanged. Funds earmarked for service quietly rerouted. And once the numbers started talking, the silence ended. As the investigation deepened, patterns emerged. Kickbacks from vendors, secret partnerships, money meant for community work redirected toward private benefit. Prosecutors didn't frame it as moral failure. They framed it as systematic exploitation. The courtroom stripped away the suit and revealed the structure beneath. This wasn't impulse. It was planning. And planning leaves trails. The defense argued mistakes, administrative errors, misunderstandings. But records don't misunderstand. Bank statements don't forget. And witnesses don't all invent the same story independently. When the verdict came, it sent shockwaves through institutional religion, not because one man fell, but because of what his fall exposed. Trust had been used as a shield. Reverence had replaced oversight. The pulpit didn't protect him when accountability finally arrived. Sentencing didn't erase the damage. Years of influence couldn't be undone with a prison term. The organization reeled. Members questioned leadership. Faith in systems, not just individuals, took a hit. After his release, Lyons attempted a return. Smaller congregations, lower profile, familiar language. But something fundamental had changed. Once authority is exposed as self-serving, it never regains its original weight. His story is uncomfortable because it's familiar. No cult robes, no apocalyptic prophecies, just power slowly drifting toward entitlement. And that's why it matters. Corruption is quiet when it wears respectability. Henry Lyons didn't demand worship. He demanded trust, and then spent it. His downfall reminds us that institutions don't fail overnight. They erode when accountability is replaced with assumption. And the next leader didn't rise through committees or boards. He claimed something far more dangerous. Chapter 5. Wayne Bent. Wayne Bent didn't ask his followers to believe in God. He asked them to believe in him. And that single shift, from messenger to embodiment, changed everything. Because when a leader claims they are the solution, there is no higher authority left to appeal to. To outsiders, he sounded eccentric, a man with strange ideas, living far from cities, preaching to a small group in the desert. But inside his community, he wasn't just respected. He was revered as the final voice, the last bridge between humanity and salvation. When a leader becomes the message, obedience stops being optional. Bent broke away from traditional religion and announced that he had received a direct personal revelation. Modern faith, he said, had failed. Only those who followed him would survive what was coming. The message was powerful because it offered certainty in a confusing world. And certainty is addictive. Families sold homes. Careers were abandoned. People relocated to a remote compound in the New Mexico desert. Isolation wasn't presented as control. It was framed as protection. Outside society was corrupt. Inside the commune was purity. Once followers were physically separated, the psychological shift accelerated. Because isolation turns guidance into law. Inside the compound, Bent controlled daily life, schedules, conversations, relationships. Even private thoughts were policed through constant spiritual evaluation. He taught that personal boundaries were illusions created by a fallen world. True healing, he claimed, required surrender, not just spiritually, but personally. Over time, his teachings crossed into deeply uncomfortable territory. He reframed intimacy as restoration. Actions that would normally trigger alarm were repackaged as divine instruction. And because he claimed direct authority from God, questioning him meant rejecting God himself. That's how manipulation works at its highest level. You don't force compliance. You redefine resistance as sin. Followers weren't told they had to obey. They were told obedience was proof of worthiness. And the most effective control is the kind that feels voluntary. Concerned relatives outside the compound began raising alarms, but law enforcement struggled to intervene. Adults insisted they were there by choice. Followers defended Bent passionately. To them, he wasn't dangerous. He was misunderstood. Everything changed when minors came forward. Allegations surfaced that Bent had engaged in behavior toward children that crossed clear moral and legal boundaries. He claimed innocence. He claimed divine command. He claimed persecution. But investigators looked at patterns, not proclamations. In court, the central question wasn't belief. It was conduct. The prosecution argued that no spiritual claim grants permission to violate personal safety, especially when authority and trust are involved. Faith didn't exempt him from the law. Bent portrayed himself as a martyr, insisting the government was attacking him for speaking truth. That narrative resonated with some followers. But evidence has weight, and weight bends belief when it stacks high enough. The verdict was a turning point. Not just for him, but for those who had built their entire lives around his identity. When sentencing arrived, Bent showed no remorse. He framed punishment as spiritual suffering. But prison stripped away the setting that sustained his authority. No compound, no audience, no ritual reinforcement. After his release, the community he built had faded, buildings decayed, members dispersed. Some still believed. Others were left with grief, guilt, and years they could never recover. That's the aftermath no sermon prepares you for. Wayne Bent's story reveals a critical danger. When someone claims exclusive access to truth, accountability disappears. And when accountability disappears, harm follows. Not because followers are weak, but because belief, once weaponized, can override instinct. When a leader replaces God, there is no appeal. And if you think this pattern ends in isolation, think again. Because the next man on this list turned faith into a broadcast and control into a business. Chapter 6. Jim Bakker. Jim Bakker didn't hide his ambitions. He put them under studio lights. He didn't whisper promises. He broadcast them. And for millions watching from their living rooms, he offered something irresistible. The idea that faith could be multiplied, measured, and rewarded. He preached a simple equation. Give generously, and heaven will respond generously. To struggling families, that message felt like hope. To Bakker, it became a business model. Because when belief is framed like a transaction, control becomes scalable. Together with his wife, Bakker transformed religious programming into entertainment. Sermons blended with music, celebrity guests, and emotional appeals designed to keep viewers engaged and donating. The tone was warm, theatrical, and persuasive. People weren't just watching a show. They felt like they were part of something chosen. At its peak, the operation reached millions every day. And Bakker understood something crucial. Visibility builds trust faster than theology. The more familiar he became, the less people questioned where the money went. But television wasn't enough. He wanted an empire you could walk through. Bakker launched a massive religious resort, marketed as a holy escape, a place where faith, leisure, and community blended seamlessly. Supporters were encouraged to buy into lifetime partnerships, promised recurring vacations as a reward for generosity. Thousands did. They believed they were investing in spiritual refuge. The problem was arithmetic. He sold far more promises than the resort could ever fulfill. Rooms didn't exist. Capacity was impossible. But the money kept coming in because the message never changed. Trust the vision. Trust the man delivering it. Behind the scenes, finances spiraled. Donations meant for ministry were redirected. Luxury replaced humility. Excess became normalized, and the machine required constant input to stay alive. When the flow slowed, the structure collapsed. Investigations followed. Records were examined. What looked like faith-based fundraising was reframed as intentional deception. Prosecutors argued that Bakker didn't just mismanage funds. He knowingly sold something he couldn't deliver, hiding behind religious language to shield himself. The courtroom stripped away the stagecraft. No applause, no music, just numbers, timelines, and testimony. The conviction was devastating. A man who once spoke daily to millions now listened in silence as his sentence was read. His ministry dissolved. The audience vanished. The empire disappeared almost overnight. And then came the question no one expected. After serving time, Bakker returned, not quietly, but cautiously. He reframed his message. Less prosperity, more survival. Less luxury, more fear of the future. Critics argued it was reinvention, not repentance. Supporters argued he was redeemed. That tension remains. What makes Bakker's story unsettling isn't just the fraud, it's the adaptability, the ability to reshape belief to fit the moment, to sense fear, scarcity, or hope, and monetize it. Because the tactics didn't disappear, they evolved. Jim Bakker proved that you don't need secrecy to manipulate. You can do it live, with cameras rolling, if the message is emotionally precise enough. He didn't demand loyalty. He inspired it, and then charged for it. When faith is priced, trust becomes inventory. His rise and fall left a permanent mark on religious broadcasting. It forced a reckoning with how easily sincerity can be staged, and how quickly devotion can be converted into revenue. And the next leader didn't build a television empire. He built his authority by fighting science, and lost it to the tax code. Chapter 7. Kent Hovind. Kent Hovind didn't build his influence by promising miracles. He built it by promising certainty. In a world full of complexity, he offered simple answers. And for many followers, that felt like the truth. Hovind styled himself as a warrior in a cultural battle. He claimed modern science was a lie, evolution was a deception, and government institutions were part of a massive cover-up. Standing on church stages and school auditoriums, he positioned himself as the brave outsider exposing corruption. His confidence was absolute. His delivery is relentless. Because when someone frames disagreement as a conspiracy, debate becomes impossible. To his supporters, Hovind wasn't just a speaker. He was a defender of faith under attack. He told audiences that questioning his views wasn't intellectual disagreement. It was surrender to deception. And once belief is framed as warfare, followers stop asking questions. They pick sides. Hovind's ministry grew quickly. He opened a creationist theme park, complete with dinosaur displays and zip lines, designed to reinforce a single message. Scripture overrides evidence. Children were taught that scientists were lying. Adults were told that institutions couldn't be trusted. Only biblical truth, as interpreted by Hovind, mattered. But while he was busy attacking science, another system was watching him closely, and it wasn't interested in theology. Behind the scenes, federal investigators were tracking money, payroll records, bank withdrawals, financial patterns that didn't match the image of a righteous ministry. According to prosecutors, Hovind had been refusing to pay payroll taxes, classifying workers as volunteers while still compensating them. He allegedly structured withdrawals to avoid reporting thresholds and moved funds through personal accounts. When questioned, Hovind didn't deny it. He rejected the premise. He argued that his ministry belonged to God, not the government. Taxes, he claimed, were unbiblical. Authority, in his view, flowed downward from heaven, not upward from law. It was the same framework he used in his preaching: divine mandate over earthly systems. The problem was simple: the courts didn't agree. When charges were filed, Hovind doubled down. He framed the case as persecution. Supporters rallied, claiming the government was silencing a man for his beliefs. The narrative was powerful. It always is. Because it transforms accountability into martyrdom. But again, belief doesn't override evidence. In court, prosecutors laid out a clear pattern. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were withdrawn in increments designed to avoid detection. Employees are instructed not to call themselves employees. Records that contradicted every public claim of innocence. The jury wasn't asked to decide whether evolution was real. They were asked whether laws had been broken. And the verdict answered that clearly. Hovind was convicted on multiple federal charges. Sentencing followed. The man who spent years telling others they were deceived now faced a reality he couldn't argue away. Prison stripped him of the stage, the audience, and the constant reinforcement that sustained his certainty. From behind bars, HOVIND continued to claim injustice. Letters circulated, recordings spread. Supporters insisted he was a prisoner of conscience. Critics pointed out the difference between belief and compliance. Here's the uncomfortable lesson. HOVIND didn't fall because of his ideas. He fell because he believed his ideas placed him above the rules everyone else had to follow. That belief is always dangerous. After his release, HOVIND returned to public life almost immediately. New platforms, new videos, same message. To followers, his imprisonment became proof that he was right all along. To others, it was proof that conviction doesn't always lead to reflection. His story shows how easily faith can be used to reject responsibility. When leaders teach that divine authority cancels accountability, followers may cheer, but systems don't, and eventually, reality intervenes. Belief doesn't cancel consequences. Kent Hovind's case reminds us that control doesn't always come from emotional manipulation alone. Sometimes it comes from intellectual certainty so rigid that it refuses correction. And when certainty hardens into defiance, collapse is inevitable. Because the next leader didn't argue against science. He argued that wealth was proof of holiness and dressed the part. Chapter 8. LAMOR Whitehead. LAMOR Whitehead didn't preach humility. He preached success. And he wore his message like a badge. Designer suits, heavy watches, luxury cars parked outside the church. To his followers, the image wasn't arrogance. It was evidence. Evidence that faith worked. He told them prosperity was a signal. If God favored you, it showed. And if you wanted that favor, you needed to align yourself with someone who already had it. Because when wealth is framed as holiness, giving becomes obligation. Whitehead's sermons weren't quiet reflections. They were performances built around aspiration. He spoke about elevation, access, and divine connection. He claimed proximity to powerful people, hinted at political influence, and presented himself as a gateway, someone who could open doors ordinary believers couldn't. For many, that promise was intoxicating. In a city where opportunity feels locked behind invisible walls, Whitehead sold the idea that faith could be a master key, and keys, he implied, weren't free. The first requests were small: mentorship fees, investments, contributions framed as seeds that would multiply. Whitehead insisted the returns would come, not just financially, but socially. Access, protection, favor. Behind the scenes, investigators would later argue that the money rarely went where it was promised. One case became central to his downfall. A woman from his congregation trusted him with her savings after he described a real estate opportunity that would change her life. She believed she was investing in stability. Prosecutors said the funds were quickly spent on personal luxury instead. When she asked questions, she was told to wait, to trust, to stop doubting a man chosen by God. That's how exploitation hides, impatience disguised as faith. As scrutiny increased, additional allegations surfaced. Whitehead was accused of leveraging perceived political connections to extract money from businessmen. He suggested he could make problems disappear or open opportunities others couldn't. It was influence theater, power implied, never proven. When federal authorities stepped in, Whitehead leaned into a familiar defense. He claimed persecution, jealousy, bias against a successful preacher. He framed himself as a target for daring to preach prosperity in public. But prosecutors focused on patterns, not presentation. And patterns don't care about charisma. Financial records told a consistent story. Promises made. Money transferred. Results missing. Texts and communications suggested intent. The image of blessing gave way to the mechanics of deception. The trial stripped the glamour away. No velvet chairs, no stage lighting, just evidence. When sentencing arrived, the language was sharp. The court emphasized betrayal, how spiritual authority had been used to bypass skepticism. This wasn't a failed investment. It was, in the court's view, a deliberate misuse of trust. The sentence was heavy, the message heavier. Religious leadership is not immunity. Today, the man once celebrated for style and confidence lives without either. No pulpit, no audience, no access. His fall became a cautionary tale, especially for those drawn to leaders who equate wealth with righteousness. Whitehead's story matters because it's modern. It happened in the age of social media, live streams, and curated images. It shows how easily faith can be packaged as a lifestyle brand, and how quickly that brand collapses under scrutiny. When faith becomes a product, followers become customers. And if you think repeating a crime requires ignorance, the next man proves it can happen even after prison. Chapter 9. Barry MINKOW. He didn't look like a criminal. That was the first advantage. He looked young, polite, almost fragile. The kind of kid adults wanted to mentor, not suspect. When he spoke, he sounded eager, not dangerous. When he smiled, people saw ambition, not calculation. And that's how it started. At 16 years old, Barry launched a carpet cleaning business out of his parents' garage. On the surface, it was harmless. Another teenage hustle. A vacuum. A van. A promise to work hard. But beneath the surface, something else was forming. Barry wasn't interested in cleaning carpets. He was interested in appearing successful. That difference mattered. When customers didn't pay fast enough, Barry learned to float checks. When expenses exceeded income, he learned to invent numbers. When creditors asked questions, he learned to overwhelm them with confidence. Each small deception taught him a dangerous lesson. Lying worked. And it worked especially well when wrapped in professionalism. As ZZZZ Best grew, the lies grew with it. Barry claimed massive contracts with insurance companies, restoration work after fires and floods. He spoke about large-scale projects that required teams, equipment, logistics. Investors were impressed. Auditors nodded along. Banks extended credit. But most of it wasn't real. The job sites didn't exist. The revenue was fabricated. The paperwork was theater. Barry didn't just lie verbally. He built entire physical illusions. Fake job locations were staged overnight. Empty buildings were dressed with rented equipment. Temporary workers were hired to look busy during inspections. Inspectors were rushed, distracted, dazzled. He understood something critical. People don't verify what they're afraid of looking foolish for doubting. By his early 20s, Barry MINKOW was everywhere. Magazine covers, television interviews, Wall Street celebrations. He became one of the youngest CEOs to take a company public. He rang the bell at the stock exchange as cameras flashed. America loved the story. A teenage dropout becomes a corporate genius. A nobody becomes a millionaire. A boy outsmarts the system. What America didn't see was the panic behind the scenes. ZZZZ Best was bleeding money. Every new lie required 3 more to support it. Every audit was a threat. Every delay risked exposure. Barry was no longer running a business. He was running from the truth. And eventually, the truth caught up. Journalists started pulling threads. Financial inconsistencies surfaced. Whistleblowers talked. The elaborate illusion collapsed faster than it was built. The fallout was brutal. Over $100 million evaporated. Investors lost retirement savings. Employees lost jobs. Families lost homes. The company imploded publicly, spectacularly. Barry Minkow was arrested, tried, and convicted of massive fraud. The prodigy became a punchline. The CEO became an inmate. Prison stripped Barry of the image he had built so carefully. No suits, no applause, no authority, just concrete walls and time. But prison didn't silence Barry Minkow. It refined him. Inside, he discovered a new narrative, one even more powerful than success: redemption. When Barry was released, he didn't return to business. He returned as a changed man. He became a Christian convert, then a pastor. He spoke openly about his sins. He described prison as a crucible. He talked about humility, repentance, and God's mercy. And people listened. Churches invited him to speak. Congregations applauded his honesty. Pastors praised his transformation. Barry cried on stage. He warned others about greed. He framed his past as a cautionary tale. The fraudster had become a witness. But something subtle was happening again. Barry wasn't just confessing. He was performing confession. He understood pacing, timing, emotional beats. He knew when to pause, when to choke up, when to lower his voice. His story was polished, repeatable, effective. And it opened doors. Barry founded a new organization focused on exposing fraud. He claimed to help churches and corporations identify corruption and unethical practices. On paper, it sounded noble, almost poetic. The man who once deceived now dedicated his life to protecting others. But beneath the surface, familiar patterns emerged. Barry's investigations often led to financial demands. His methods were aggressive, his claims exaggerated, his tactics manipulative. Slowly, accusations began to pile up. People started asking questions again. And just like before, Barry framed those questions as attacks. Critics were painted as enemies. Investigations were dismissed as persecution. Accountability was rebranded as harassment. The language changed. The behavior didn't. Barry Minkow was arrested again. This time, it wasn't Wall Street. It was the very moral authority he claimed to defend. The shock wasn't just that he committed fraud again. It was where he did it. Faith communities, church networks, spaces built on trust. Barry had learned that belief systems create shortcuts. When someone confesses publicly, people assume transparency. When someone claims transformation, people suspend skepticism. When someone speaks the language of faith, questioning feels immoral. Barry exploited that. Not because he hated religion, but because he understood human psychology. He knew that people want redemption stories to be true. They want endings where lessons are learned and cycles end. They want proof that bad people become good. Barry gave them that story, again and again. And every time, the same pattern repeated: charm, trust, control, collapse. His life exposes an uncomfortable truth. Some people don't just lie to get money. They lie to maintain identity. Barry Minkow didn't know how to exist without an audience, without belief, without authority. Whether as a CEO or a pastor, he needed to be seen as someone worth following. And belief, unchecked belief, gave him that. Today, Barry Minkow's name isn't inspirational. It's instructional. His story is taught not just as a case study in fraud, but as a warning about charisma, confession, and the danger of equating remorse with reform. Because remorse can be real. But patterns don't disappear without accountability. Barry didn't fail once. He failed in chapters. And each chapter followed the same structure: rise, exposure, apology, reinvention. Until the reinvention ran out of places to hide. His story leaves a final question hanging in the air, one that applies far beyond him. When someone tells you they've changed, when they speak with conviction, when they frame doubt as betrayal, do you listen or do you verify? Because belief, when handed over too easily, doesn't save people. It protects liars. And Barry MINKOW understood that better than almost anyone. Chapter 10. Brett Jared Monroe. He never needed to raise his voice. That was the most unsettling thing about him. He didn't scream, threaten, or demand. He didn't surround himself with symbols of power or claim divine authority. He didn't ask people to worship him. He asked them to listen. And once they did, everything else followed. Brett presented himself as thoughtful, calm, almost gentle, the kind of man who spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, as if he were more interested in truth than influence. He framed every idea as a shared discovery, rather than a directive. "I'm not telling you what to believe," he would say. "I'm just asking questions." That framing disarmed people, because people don't fear questions. They fear force. And Brett never used force, at least not at first. His early conversations revolved around dissatisfaction, not anger, not rebellion, just quiet disappointment with the world as it was. He spoke about society as something subtly broken, about how people were pressured into lives they didn't choose, about how families, schools, governments, and even friendships train people to suppress their instincts. It sounded intelligent, reasonable, even compassionate. To people who already felt alienated or exhausted, Brett didn't sound dangerous. He sounded like relief. Slowly, he reframed discomfort as insight, pain as awareness, isolation as awakening. If you felt disconnected from your family, it meant you were evolving. If you struggled to relate to friends, it meant you were seeing through illusions they couldn't yet perceive. Brett didn't tell people they were wrong. He told them they were ahead. And once someone believes they're ahead of everyone else, they stop asking where they're being led. There were no formal meetings in the beginning, no doctrine, no labels, just long discussions that stretched for hours. Brett encouraged people to talk openly about their fears, insecurities, and past failures. He listened attentively, remembered details, repeated people's own words back to them later. It felt intimate, safe, but it wasn't accidental. Every confession became information. Every vulnerability became leverage. As people grew closer to Brett, he gently encouraged distance from outsiders. Parents were described as emotionally controlling. Friends were dismissed as shallow or asleep. Critics were portrayed as threats to clarity. "You can't hear truth when you're surrounded by noise," he'd say. Isolation wasn't enforced. It was justified. Those who stayed began spending more time together, living together, working together. Brett framed this as alignment, community, efficiency. He insisted that shared living removed ego and created honesty. In reality, it removed escape. Over time, Brett's philosophy sharpened. He spoke about rules as artificial constraints, laws as agreements that only applied to those who believed in them, morality as a social invention used to control behavior. At first, it sounded abstract. Then, it became practical. Followers were encouraged to abandon conventional jobs, education, and responsibilities. Money was pooled. Personal possessions were shared or surrendered. Privacy was framed as secrecy. Independence was reframed as selfishness. Resistance wasn't punished directly. It was analyzed. If someone expressed doubt, Brett didn't argue. He questioned their emotional maturity, their fear, their attachment to the old world. He suggested they weren't ready yet. That suggestion cut deeper than any command. Because no one wanted to be the one who wasn't ready. Sleep became irregular. Long conversations extended late into the night. Exhaustion blurred judgment. Group discussions turned into sessions where individuals were pressured to confess doubts, failures, or impure thoughts. Everything shared was remembered. Nothing was forgotten. Brett positioned himself as the sole interpreter of progress. Approval became rare. Disapproval was subtle, but devastating. Silence, disappointment, public questioning disguised as concern. And still, many stayed. Because leaving meant admitting they had surrendered years of their life to a lie. As the group became more closed, Brett's control intensified. Former members would later describe an atmosphere of constant monitoring, movements observed, conversations overheard, loyalty tested. What had been sold as freedom now required total obedience. Behind closed doors, reports of abuse began to surface. Psychological manipulation escalated into intimidation. Control extended into physical boundaries, personal relationships, even bodily autonomy. Brett's philosophy provided justification for everything. If something felt wrong, it was because the individual was still programmed. If someone suffered, it was because they were resisting truth. If harm occurred, it was reframed as necessary transformation. Outsiders noticed changes. Families reported loved ones becoming unreachable, unrecognizable. Former friends described blank stares, scripted language, emotional detachment. Eventually, some escaped. Their stories were disturbing. They described fear masked as enlightenment, control disguised as logic, abuse framed as liberation. A man who spoke endlessly about autonomy while stripping it away piece by piece. Authorities began investigating. When law enforcement finally intervened, the image Brett had constructed collapsed. Testimonies revealed systematic coercion. Evidence showed a deliberate pattern of isolation, manipulation, and abuse. The calm philosopher was exposed as a calculated controller. Brett Jared Monroe was arrested. In court, the contrast was stark. The man who rejected systems now faced one. The leader who dismissed laws now relied on them for protection. The voice that once dominated every conversation sat quiet as victims spoke. The verdict confirmed what many had feared. Brett was convicted. But conviction didn't erase the damage. Former followers described long-lasting psychological harm, difficulty trusting others, shame for recruiting friends and family, guilt for staying silent, confusion over what parts of their identity were ever truly theirs. Because Brett didn't just control actions, he controlled meaning. He taught people how to interpret their own thoughts, emotions, and doubts through his lens. Once that lens was removed, many were left disoriented, unsure of who they were without his framework. That is what made him so dangerous. Brett Jared Monroe didn't need religion, money, or spectacle. He didn't promise heaven or wealth. He promised understanding. And understanding, when monopolized by one person, becomes absolute power. His story exposes a modern form of control that doesn't look like a cult until it's too late. One that hides behind reason. One that speaks the language of intelligence and freedom while constructing an invisible cage. Brett didn't fail because his ideas were obviously extreme. He failed because reality eventually intruded. And when a closed belief system meets external scrutiny, it fractures. Today, Brett Jared Monroe's name stands as a warning, not about loud extremists or dramatic prophets, but about quiet voices, intellectual manipulation, and the danger of mistaking agreement for truth. Because the most effective prisons aren't built with walls, they're built with ideas. And the most dangerous leaders don't command obedience.
They convince you it was your idea all along.